The first flight to the South Pole, or should I say the first flight that actually landed at the South Pole, was a customised US Navy R-4D Skytrain called the K-Sarah, which landed at the geographic South Pole on October 31st, 1956. The crew of that plane were the first people to stand at the South Pole since the Amundsen and Scott expeditions of 1911. Now, incredibly, that same year, 1956, saw the very first sightseeing flight to Antarctica. This flight, originating from the southern Chilean city of Punta Arenas, took 66 tourists on a 9-hour round-trip flight which passed over the Antarctic regions of the South Shetlands and the Trinity Peninsula. These first pioneering tourist flights continued sporadically throughout the late 1950s, but it wasn't until the development of more modern airliners with longer ranges that Antarctic sightseeing tours became feasible for anyone other than the Chilean national airline. Now, as early as 1968, Air New Zealand had mooted the possibility of offering sightseeing trips to Antarctica. However, the decision was made to wait until they had a new fleet of DC-10s available before offering this service. DC-10s, with a much longer range, could make the 12-hour return trip without needing to land and refuel. Spurred on due to public demand and from Australian airline Qantas's announcement that they would be starting sightseeing trips, Air New Zealand made its first Antarctic sightseeing flight on February 15, 1977. From the get-go, it was clear that these would be no ordinary flights. All passengers would be treated to first-class service, including a champagne breakfast, 5-star gourmet lunch, and an open bar. As souvenirs of their flight, passengers received limited edition maps and brochures. The aircraft was intentionally underbooked to ensure that there was plenty of room on board for the tourists to move around and to get those great views out of the windows. On top of this, each flight provided a guide in the form of an Antarctic expert. He was there to provide commentary and was on hand to answer any questions. And these guides included some high-profile names, like for example Sir Edmund Hillary, who, apart from his conquest of Everest, was also famous for his expeditions across Antarctica. These sightseeing flights also differed dramatically from regular flights in one other important aspect, and that is that they would fly much, much lower than normal, as, after all, they were sightseeing flights. But just how low they went is surprising. The big DC-10 airliners would descend to altitudes of just a few hundred feet in order to give the tourists some great close-up views of the scenery speeding by below. Now, this might sound reckless, to say the least, but if visibility was good and the pilot competent, there wasn't any inherent reason why a plane of this size couldn't fly at this level. Indeed, during the sightseeing flights of 1977 and 78, flying at this very low level had occurred many times without incident. Air New Zealand flight TE901 was the last scheduled Antarctic sightseeing flight of the 1979 season. Just 4 flights had been organised for 1979, all happening in November, and they were all fully booked within days of being announced. The last flight of the season was set for November the 28th and would be piloted by Captain Jim Collins. This would be his first and tragically last Antarctic flight. The November the 28th flight was scheduled to leave Auckland just after 8 in the morning, but it was delayed for some minutes after a female passenger demanded to leave the aircraft before it took off. Although feeling oddly apprehensive about the flight, she eventually reboarded the plane after being assured by Air New Zealand staff that the Antarctic flights were indeed safe and that there was nothing to worry about. The initial part of the flight was uneventful. It was just a long haul over the Southern Ocean towards the Antarctic landmass, but as the DC-10 neared the coastline, it descended down to around 10,000 feet. By now, the DC-10 was in communication with air traffic control at McMurdo, the American research station which is located at the southern end of Ross Island. McMurdo Air Traffic Control advised the crew of the DC-10 that there was a layer of overcast cloud at around 2,000 feet, but clear underneath. If needed, they could provide radar-assisted descent for the crew. As the airliner descended by making 2 loops, one to the left and one to the right, the flight crew informed McMurdo that they'd spotted a gap in the cloud and that they would continue down visually. This was at around 12:42 p.m. At 12:45, the crew radioed McMurdo to inform them that they were already down to around 6,000 feet, visually heading for McMurdo, and would be continuing the descent down to about 1,500 feet. On board the DC-10, most of the passengers were by now pressed up against the windows, cameras in hand, getting ready to snap away at the majestic and unspoilt wilderness which would shortly be passing just a few hundred feet below them. In the cockpit, Captain Jim Collins engaged the navigation system to lock back onto the track, which would take the plane down the middle of McMurdo Sound. This gave great views to Ross Island and Mt Erebus to the left, and the icy valleys and the peaks of Victoria Land to the right. Ahead, Collins could only see a blank white vista, but he wasn't worried. At any moment, he would certainly see details of the landscape emerging as the plane continued downwards. Suddenly, the ground proximity warning blared into life.
Terrain, pull up, pull up.
Pull up, pull up. Collins reacted immediately, applying maximum thrust and pulling back hard on the yoke, but it was way too late for evasive action. A couple of seconds later, the DC-10, with 257 people on board, ploughed straight into the lower northern flank of Mt Erebus, killing everyone on board instantly. This grainy photograph showing fuel or hydraulic fluid spraying onto the window came from a passenger's camera recovered from the wreck. It's likely that this person had their finger on the shutter, ready to take a photograph when the crash occurred, and we can only assume that at the exact moment of impact the button was pressed, unintentionally capturing the haunting final moment of Flight 901. The first sign to the outside world that something had gone very wrong was when the DC-10 failed to check in again. McMurdo Air Traffic Control had been expecting a radio call from Flight 901 every 10 minutes or so, but instead they heard nothing. Despite repeated calls from McMurdo, there was just an ominous silence. Within the hour, they'd sent out spotter planes to check the route of Flight 901, but they could find no trace of the airliner. McMurdo then informed the authorities in New Zealand that contact had been lost. And when the DC-10 failed to appear in the skies above Christchurch by 7 o'clock that night, authorities had no choice but to list the plane as overdue. As word spread, anxious New Zealanders tuned into the TV and radio, hoping against hope that the plane would somehow miraculously reappear. But by 10 o'clock that night, and that was past the point that the DC-10 would have run out of fuel, Air New Zealand CEO Maury Davis went on TV to announce the sombre news. Fuel reserves were exhausted approximately half an hour ago. The aircraft has to be down. Due to the long summer days of Antarctica, the McMurdo search crews were able to carry on looking throughout the night, and at around 1:30 in the morning, a streak of black debris was spotted at around 1,400 feet on the lower slopes of Mt Erebus. Flight 901 had been found, and the morning papers led with the story. The DC-10 had crashed onto the slopes of Mt Erebus, and there were no apparent survivors. For search and rescue teams, Flight 901 would prove to be an especially arduous task. In order to get any idea of why the plane flew straight into the side of a 12,400-foot volcano, which should have been clearly visible right in front of them, they would need to recover the black boxes from the site. But conditions at the crash site were awful. Blizzards, lack of shelter, high winds and sub-zero temperatures all made the business of recovering the remains of the passengers and the black boxes much more difficult than usual. A team of New Zealand police officers were flown out to the crash site to begin what was known as Operation Overdue. The words of Inspector Jim Morgan described the frozen hell that the men found themselves in. We all spent about a week cramped in polar tents amidst the wreckage and dead bodies, maintaining a 24-hour work schedule. We split the men into 2 shifts, and recovered with great effort all the human remains at the site. Many bodies were trapped under tons of fuselage and wings, and much physical effort was required to dig them out and extract them. Initially there was very little water at the site and we only had one bowl between all of us to wash our hands in before eating. The water was black. In the first days on site we didn't wash our plates and utensils after eating, but handed them on to the next shift because we were unable to wash them. I couldn't eat my first meal on site because it was a meat stew. Our polar clothing became covered in black human grease. All bodies and body parts were photographed in situ by US Navy photographers who worked with us. Also, US Navy personnel helped us lift and pack bodies into body bags, which was very exhausting work. We felt relieved when the first resupply of woolen gloves arrived because ours had become saturated in the human grease. Later, the scuba gulls began eating the bodies in front of us, causing us much mental anguish, as well as destroying the chances of identifying the corpses. We tried to shoo them away, but to no avail. We then threw flares, also to no avail. Because of this, we had to pick up all the bodies' parts that had been bagged and create 11 large piles of human remains around the crash site and bury them under snow to keep the birds off. It was immensely exhausting work. After we'd almost completed the mission, we were trapped by bad weather and isolated. At that point, I allowed the liquor that had survived the crash to be given out and we had a party. Macabre, but we had to let off steam. As the weather cleared, the helos were able to get back, and we then were able to hook the piles of bodies in cargo nets under the helicopters, and they were taken away to McMurdo. Due to the efforts of the men of Operation Overdue, it was possible to positively identify over 80% of the body parts recovered from Mt Erebus. The burnt-out wreckage, too much to recover and too difficult to remove, was left where it was. It remains there to this day, and, weather permitting, it's occasionally still visible on the lower north flank of Mt Erebus. The black boxes were recovered intact, and the task of working out exactly what had gone wrong began. Now, no one thought this was going to be an easy task, but on the other hand, I don't think anyone at the time had any idea of just how controversial these findings would prove to be. I'll admit that even having read through the story of the inquiry several times, I'm still not entirely sure of what conclusion can be reached. I'll be posting a much more detailed summary of my findings on the Patreon page, but for this video I'm going to keep this as short and simple as possible, so bear with me as things from here on in get a bit complicated. The official inquiry into the crash of Flight 901 was headed up by New Zealand's Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, a man called Ron Chippendale. Using the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, as well as an abundance of photographic evidence from the cameras of the doomed passengers, he came to the conclusion that ultimately pilot error was to blame for the crash. The Chippendale report confirmed that there had been no error on the part of the nav computer, the waypoint coordinates had been entered correctly, and the flight plan had been followed correctly. In his summary, Chippendale came to the conclusion that the pilot had intentionally flown below safe limits, whereupon he'd become the victim of an optical illusion, a phenomenon known as a visual whiteout, where the sea ice, the cloud and the sky merge into one sheet of continuous white. This prevented Captain Collins from seeing the lower flank of Mt Erebus, even though it's right in front of him. Unsure of where the plane actually was, the crew as a whole had failed to take adequate measures to ensure the safety of the aircraft, and the result was the catastrophic loss of Flight 901. The blame for the deaths of 257 people lay squarely with Captain Jim Collins and his flight crew. Now, at around the same time that the Chippendale report was published, a second parliamentary inquiry got underway, headed up by Justice Peter Mahan. In what would prove to be a bombshell report, the Mahan inquiry was to reach an entirely different conclusion altogether. Mahan's report highlighted some things which had either been overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant in Chippendale's paper. Most importantly was the fact that the coordinates for the nav track for Flight 901 had been altered the day before the tragic flight. Now, various explanations for this were put forward, from correcting a typo in the original plan to altering the flight plan to satisfy some bureaucratic map review that was coming up shortly, But the key thing, though, was that no one informed the senior flight crew of this change of plan. The route that they'd been previously briefed on was no longer the same route that the nav computer would be following. They thought that they would be flying directly into McMurdo Sound, but the new route had them flying directly over Mt Erebus. As to the idea that Jim Collins was flying recklessly by being so low, well, everybody knew that it was common practice for these sightseeing flights to drop down to 1,500 feet or even lower. There were many existing photographs which proved this, and there was much eyewitness testimony from previous flights about the clarity of the landscape as the aircraft descended to these levels. I mean, after all, low flying and close-up sightseeing, these were the main selling points for the whole Antarctic experience. Captain Collins wasn't flying in any way that other previous flights already hadn't done, and Air New Zealand knew this perfectly well. I mean, some of their own upper management had been on these flights and had written glowing internal memos about the experience. Their pretense that this low-level flying was something that, they knew nothing about was plainly ludicrous. Also, a key factor in Chippendale's summary was the fact that the crew must have been uncertain of their position. But again, that didn't seem to fit with the evidence. On the cockpit voice recorder, the crew appear composed and confident just prior to the crash. Conversations between the pilot and the first officer don't indicate any sense of being lost or being unsure of their position. Muffled conversations in the rear of the cockpit, which were difficult to make out, seemed to have been transcribed in a way that made it appear that the crew were lost. Again, evidence seems to have been twisted to fit the theory. As Mahan dug deeper, other disturbing evidence appeared. Eyewitness accounts of Air New Zealand staff frantically gathering up papers and files and shredding evidence on the day following the crash. Important documentation went missing from the homes of the deceased captain and the first officer. The captain's logbook, recovered from the crash site, was handed into the inquiry with pages torn out. The whole thing just stank of a cover-up, and when Mahan released his findings, he didn't hold back. The palpably false sections of evidence which I heard could not have been the result of any mistake or faulty recollection. They were very clearly part of an attempt to conceal a series of disastrous administrative blunders, and so, I am forced reluctantly to say that I had to listen to an orchestrated litany of lies. In his opinion, Air New Zealand had known all along that the most probable cause for the crash was the last-minute alteration to the nav track, an alteration which somebody forgot to mention to the crew. So when Flight 901 took off that morning, the 28th of November 1979, it was already doomed. In order to avoid paying out millions of dollars in compensation, Air New Zealand had desperately tried to cover this up. So on the one hand, the Chippendale report blamed the low-level flying of the flight crew, acknowledging that the nav track change was there but dismissing it as irrelevant. And then on the other hand, Mahan's findings pointed to an entire cover-up of the whole thing by Air New Zealand. It was a disastrous blunder which had doomed the airliner from the start. And as you might expect, the whole thing became a highly charged political football. The New Zealand Prime Minister publicly admonished Mahan for his findings, but as he had friends and relatives on the board of Air New Zealand, the parliamentary opposition took full advantage of this glaring conflict of interest. Air New Zealand's CEO, Maury Davis, refused to resign, but ultimately he was forced out by the board. Now, he received death threats and was regarded as a pariah by the general public. Mahan became like a public hero. He was seen as the one honest judge who was willing to fight for the truth, to fight for the families of those who'd been lost. The whole affair ended up in the High Court, where 5 judges ultimately sided with Air New Zealand. They argued that Mahan's findings of a cover-up were outside of his remit. In other words, even if he was right, well, it was none of his business. Peter Mahan, having been publicly admonished by the courts, resigned a broken man. He died in 1986, and his famous report was never officially recognised by the New Zealand government. Air New Zealand never flew to Antarctica again. 40 years later, in 2019, the New Zealand government apologised for its role in the affair, but there was no new evidence and there was no clarification as to who was really to blame. The mysteries of Flight 901 refused to go away. Even to this day, the case is hotly debated on online aviation forums. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, a solitary cross in the snowy wastes of Antarctica stands as a marker, a memorial to the 257 people who lost their lives on the frozen slopes of Mt Erebus all those years ago.